Hello, so I'm currently studying human nature in my AS philosophy revision class sort of thing, and yeah, so we got this booklet and I've been working through it, and I wrote like I don't know what it is, like an interpretation of Genesis 3 on the back. So I think I'm just gonna read through it and then maybe talk through some of my ideas a little bit further afterwards. But yeah, you probably won't like this if you're an atheist, but I guess it's um I think what how I like to interpret it is not something that happened literally. So I don't think there necessarily was actually a garden with Adam and Eve in it. I think it's a more of a symbolic reference, if anything, and the way I see it is a symbolic reference to the transition from childhood to adulthood. And yeah, well, that's basically how I see it anyway. But I'll read this and then explain my ideas a little bit further. Okay. Uh, Genesis seems to be a story of life. Perhaps Adam and Eve were always going to die, but their longing to disobey God, Father, and eat from the tree of knowledge caused them to become aware of what we might call adult truths. Children are generally sheltered from the world of work, conversations about mortality, and are unaware childbearing of the painful childbearing process. Life becomes difficult as an adult, and this is inevitable. We have to adapt. We have to adopt a burden of responsibility, which is essentially to work for the rest of our lives. This is represented in Genesis as God condemning man to eat from the ground which is covered in thistles and thorns. This implies that he has to work for his food rather than just plucking food from the trees in the Garden of Eden, which is childlike. Children are dependent on adults. And this work won't be easy because thorns and thistles will obstruct his path, and this is symbolic of the struggle of the adult world. We get to a point where we realise nothing of worth comes easy. We have to struggle for the necessities of life. This separates children from adults. Children may get told this, but remain naive until they have actually had to experience the struggles of the adult world. We can look at the garden as a safe place. Nature is chaotic and dangerous, but nature which has been tended to is chaos, and that's basically, or nature which has been tended to is chaos put into order, and that's essentially the garden. Um, we may question why God would allow evil, the serpent, into his perfect creation. We could argue that malevolence is a necessary condition to maturity. We have to be exposed to it in order to learn a lesson. But when we have first malevolence, we can't unface it. It causes a change in us. We are no longer naive in the world. We become aware of the possibility and probability of danger and pathology. Some might argue that it's evil on God's part for making Adam and Eve aware of evil, but arguably, he's making them aware of an inevitable and unavoidable truth. The truth may hurt, but it's better than maintaining a naive lie and living in the dark. Well, then this poses the question, if God was omnibenevolent and omnipotent, why would he create a world with necessary evil? We could refute this question by saying God can only do that which is logically possible. It's logically impossible to make a square circle or a rock too heavy for God to lift. Perhaps this also implies Perhaps this also applies to evil. God, logically speaking, couldn't create good without simultaneously creating evil. He knew due to his omniscience that Adam and Eve would eventually have to be made aware of the evil in the world, so he implemented temptation, which is the serpent, who beguiled them to eat from the tree of knowledge. Perhaps God wanted to protect his children, but to protect someone you don't keep them in the dark, you expose them to that which could harm them and teach them how to defend themselves and deal with it. And this is growing up. So yeah, you can sort of see the narrative that I'll base this on, and it's basically a transition from childhood to adulthood, like I said earlier. And so I don't think this is something that actually happened. I don't think that there was a Garden of Eden. I don't think that God was walking around in an anthropomorphic form, which means he had a body. But yeah, I think it's definitely symbolic. I think the fact that there's a snake in there, it sort of made me think of the yin and the yang. So it's like you can't have good without also having the bad within the good. That's just unavoidable. That's a truth to life, which we can't get rid of, and maybe we don't even want to get rid of it. Because we don't know what a completely good world would be like, and I doubt that that's even possible because of individual differences. I think we've tried to achieve what some people see as a utopian society, and it's completely failed because of individual differences. One person's utopia is another's dystopia. Like, some people might care for the poor and they might want equality, but other people might want to live in a competitive capitalist society whereby the individual can flourish. And for me, that's the better option. And yes, that means that libertarian thinking means that there is going to be inequality, but inequality is a sign that people are able to that people aren't living in a totalitarian regime whereby everyone has to be the same. And often by everyone being the same, it doesn't mean that you raise the poor up to be the level of the rich or the middle class, and then you bring everyone down to this set level of richness, I could say, of prosperity. It generally means that you oppress the rich people, the people with the money, and you could see this in the Soviet Union. And I think there was something that I was researching this morning. I think it was this morning or yesterday. Anyway, it was at some point in the last 2 days about the Ukrainian famine, and what happened was the governments basically, because they wanted to achieve this egalitarian ideal, they took all of the rich and successful farmers and they exported them to different countries, or they killed them, or they raped them, and they did all these reprehensible things to try and get everyone onto that level playing field. But in doing so, they essentially destroyed the competent people, and obviously that's not going to be conducive to living in a good society. So if you get rid of all the competent farmers, and I think Jordan Peterson called this something like the feeder distribution, and it's the idea that 10% of the people do half of the work. So it's like if you've got 10 people, one person will do half of the work, and apparently this is just how it works. In the world, that's just a rule. Just like the efficiency, which is the idea that success is linear and failure is linear. Anyway, I've gone a bit off topic there. So if you remove all of the successful people and all of the competent people who do the best jobs, then you're left with the people who are less competent, and there's still going to be inequality within that group of people as well, because 10% of that group of people they're going to be at a lower standard than the people that you got rid of, but they'll be at the highest standard within that group, but they're not going to be doing the job correctly. And this basically ended up leading to a massive famine where there was it was like collectivization or something, and collectivization farms, and I think it was called dekulakisation, where the state the process I've just described, they removed all of the kulaks, which were the successful farmers, the rich farmers who were producing the most grain and doing the best for society. But obviously this posed a threat to the egalitarian regime, which was trying to be implemented by the totalitarian governments at the time in Ukraine. So obviously getting rid of that was extremely problematic. People they ran out of food, basically, and millions of people ended up dying. And debatably, this has been labelled as a form of genocide, and I think it was it's a word beginning with H. Okay, I don't know what it was, but it basically meant death by starvation or murder by starvation, and that was the translation that of the word, but I can't remember the word off the top of my head. Anyway, so this is what happened under the reign of Stalin, and it got extremely bad. can't remember why I got onto this topic. Okay, so I was talking about Genesis, now I'm talking about political ideologues. Right, yeah. Trying to impose a utopian vision onto Earth. Got a bit off topic, but so you get the idea. You can't implement a utopia onto Earth. We can't have a completely equal society, and we don't necessarily know if we want that. And I don't think we do want that. I think to want a completely equal society is to be misinformed about the nature of humanity and the way that societies are formulated. Like, I don't necessarily know what the solution for society is, but I know it's not communism. Because, yeah, well, just go read up on dekulakisation and on the way that the Soviet Union falsely imprisoned people for speaking out against the Soviet narrative or the communist narrative at the time, and criticising Stalin, who basically, you weren't allowed to do that. It was a complete suppression of freedom of speech, and it just caused a complete collapse in society and led to the deaths of millions of people. And like I was just saying about the famine, it was some scholars have argued, or some extremely intelligent people have argued, I don't know if scholars is the right word, some people have argued that it's actually a form of genocide, the Ukrainian famine, because it was a man-made famine. It wasn't that the weather caused it, or it was caused by natural disasters and food was unable to grow. It was basically the idea that the government caused the famine by getting rid of all the competent people. And yeah, so it is essentially a form of genocide, because the government prevented farmers from making grain, which would then be turned into food and to feed the millions of people or billions of people in the Soviet Union. But when that structure fell apart, then obviously millions of people died. So that's basically genocide. Okay, so utopias don't work. And we don't want to live in a utopia. So we can complain about the evil in the world, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't want it to exist, because the fact that there's evil suggests that we have individual differences, and it suggests that we're able to make our own way through life in a libertarian manner. And that's better than being in a totalitarian regime, which is what most utopias turn into. Yeah. And also we can link this to Aldous Huxley's book as well. And I think I'm probably milking this point a little bit, that we don't want to live in a perfect world, but yeah. So Aldous Huxley wrote a book called Brave New World, and I haven't read it yet, but I've got it upstairs on my bookshelf, and I've studied the key concepts in it, and it's basically the idea that these people get put on this perfect world, but there's a proportion of them who want to make it back to their original world where there's imperfections, and it's like that's what gives their life meaning. So you would think that if people were living on a perfect world, that everything would be perfect and good, and everyone would just enjoy being there. But it turns out that's not the case. And this is a fictitious novel, but I think there is truth to it in reality as well, as you can see with communism and other ideas like that.